Welcome back to the deep dive. So, if you're out there dreaming about living abroad, maybe setting up your laptop in bustling Hanoi, or perhaps finding your groove near a beach in Da Nang, then yeah, this deep dive is definitely for you. We're tackling one of the questions we hear all the time from digital nomads and remote workers. Can you really work remotely or freelance legally while you're living in Vietnam? Okay. Let's unpack this. Our main source today is this really fantastic and super practical podcast. It's called Living Vietnam, The Expat Life Unfiltered. It's hosted by Phong from Procare Hanoi. And, these guys seem to know their stuff, not just on the legal side, but they even help expats fix phones and laptops, kind of sorting out daily life stuff too. Phong positions the podcast as a direct, no-fluff guide, really offering genuine, real-world insights into, well, the complexities of expat life over there. It promises to cut through the noise, give us the facts, and that's exactly what we want to pull out today.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how this source really helps us cut through some of the common assumptions people have about working abroad.
Right.
So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear. Let's extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from Phong's insights. We want to provide real clarity on Vietnam's legal landscape.
Yeah.
We'll look at what's actually permitted versus what's just, tolerated for now. And most importantly, highlight the concrete pathways you can take for truly legal remote work in Vietnam. It's about getting beyond just hoping it's okay.
I think that's so crucial because, well, when you talk about Vietnam, the first way in for so many digital nomads seems to be a tourist visa. It looks simple, right?
Yeah.
But it immediately throws up this huge question about legality. The source digs right into this, what they call the gray zone. Here's where it gets really interesting. How exactly do they define that precarious space?
Well, it's a dilemma they lay out pretty clearly. The undeniable fact, straight from the Source podcast, is that Vietnamese tourist visas, doesn't matter if it's an e-visa or a visa exemption, they simply do not authorize any type of work, period. And that's true even if your employer is, say, back in London or New York or all your clients are outside Vietnam. The bottom line is you're physically in Vietnam, and that visa category isn't for working.
So technically illegal right from the start. That feels pretty clear-cut. But then the source also mentions this practical reality. What's the nuance there? What's actually happening?
Right. And this is where it gets a bit, tricky, maybe a little unsettling for some listeners. The practical reality, as Phong points out, is that Vietnam's immigration authorities aren't aggressively cracking down on remote workers using tourist visas yet. And that yet is the really critical word here. That's the gray zone. Technically illegal, but in practice, often tolerated, especially if you keep a low profile, don't make waves. But the source really stresses that this leniency isn't guaranteed. It could absolutely change. It's very fluid.
Right, that yet hangs heavy. I found it interesting they call it a gray zone instead of just illegal. It sort of implies this unstated understanding, maybe. Now, some people try to navigate this using business visas, the DN1 or DN2. What are those exactly? Do they offer a real solution?
Good question. So the DN1 and DN2 visas, they're specific categories for people doing business or investment activities in Vietnam. The source is clear. These visas require a sponsoring company located in Vietnam. But here's the catch, and this is where the risk comes in. Unless you are genuinely working for that specific sponsoring company, like they've hired you, they're sorting your permits, just using a business visa for general freelancing or remote work for your foreign clients, that's still considered pretty risky if the authorities decide to look closer. It's definitely not a free pass for any kind of work.
Okay, that makes sense. Not a loophole then. And something that really jumped out at me from this source, and I think it might surprise a few people listening, is that unlike, say, Thailand or Indonesia nearby, Vietnam still doesn't have an official digital nomad visa. That feels like a huge missing piece for this whole remote work crowd.
It absolutely is a missing piece. And it really highlights a broader tension, doesn't it? This raises an important question. How do countries actually navigate this push and pull between wanting to attract global talent and, upholding their existing legal frameworks for work and residency? The situation in Vietnam, as described, kind of showcases this perfectly. You've got the clear economic plus of foreigners spending money, but then you have a legal system that hasn't quite caught up with this modern mobile workforce. It's this interplay between the reality on the ground and the official law, and right now the law hasn't fully adapted for digital nomads.
So that yet, we mentioned, really underscores how precarious it is, doesn't it? Which brings us right to the core issue. How do you tell the difference between what's actually properly legal and what's just being overlooked for now? The source admits, loads of expats do freelance or work remotely quietly from Vietnam, and many never run into problems. But let's focus on the strictly legal perspective. What does that look like?
Exactly. And the source lays out two paths that are, well, unequivocally legal. No gray area here. First, holding a proper work permit, having a valid temporary residence card, a TRC, and having a contract with a registered Vietnamese company. That's the gold standard. The second completely legal way is if you're self-employed, but you've officially registered as an investor in your own company there in Vietnam. These two options give you clear, solid legal standing.
Got it. Okay, those sound like real stable foundations. On the other side of the coin, what's definitely not legal, like zero gray zone allowed.
Well, the source is pretty blunt here. Definitely not legal. Working remotely while you're on a tourist visa, that's the big one. Also, doing freelance gigs for Vietnamese clients without having any kind of business registration yourself. That's a definite no-no. And finally, running an online business from Vietnam without paying any taxes to Vietnam. That's explicitly against the rules.
Right, that tax piece is critical.
Yeah.
Okay, then we have that tolerated category, which is where it sounds like a lot of people currently find themselves. What does that specifically mean, and what are the risks really?
So that tolerated bucket, it specifically refers to working for foreign clients on your laptop while you happen to be in Vietnam on a tourist visa. Especially the source notes, if you maintain a quiet, low profile. It's not a green light, though. It's more like a flashing yellow, maybe. The source strongly emphasizes that while Vietnam hasn't been super strict so far, things can change. They even mention potential factors like increased digital surveillance, maybe tightening visa policies that we've seen happening elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So, yeah, it's not permanent. It's basically a gamble.
It's like mistaking a friendly wave for a signed contract, right? That difference is huge, especially if you're thinking long term. The source really seems to hammer home that this informal tolerance isn't a real strategy. Which brings us to the next big question. So what does this all mean for you if you're serious about making Vietnam your sustainable home base? How do you actually move out of that shaky gray zone and into a truly legal, secure setup? Thankfully, our source does outline some concrete paths.
Yes, absolutely. And what's fascinating here is how these concrete legal avenues offer more than just staying out of trouble. They offer a foundation for, deeper integration, genuine peace of mind. It's about moving beyond that inherent uncertainty of the gray zone. Let's break them down.
Okay, let's dive into option one then, the investor visa, or two. How does that actually work?
All right, this is a pretty solid pathway.
Right.
The way it works is you start your own business in Vietnam. It could even be just a small, one-person company. The benefits are pretty significant. This route gets you an investor TRC, a temporary residence card, which can be valid for up to 5 years. And crucially, it does not require you to get a separate work permit. But of course, there are obligations. You have to pay corporate tax and your personal income tax in Vietnam. So this option, it's really best suited for serious remote workers or digital entrepreneurs who are committed, who want a legitimate long-term presence there. It's
Ah.
basically an investment in your legal status.
Okay, that sounds like a proper long-term solution. What's option two?
Option two is getting sponsored by a Vietnamese company. So if you're freelancing or consulting for local clients in Vietnam, you can actually arrange for one of them to sponsor your visa and your work permit. Now, it definitely involves more paperwork than just getting a tourist visa, obviously, but it's 100% legal. The sponsoring company needs to be properly licensed, and naturally, you'll need to pay tax on the income you earn through them. This is a really good route for people who've already got stable working relationships or contracts with local Vietnamese partners. It just formalizes everything and gives you that clear legal footing.
Right, so if you're doing business locally anyway, make it official. Makes sense. And then for people with maybe a more personal connection, there's option three. Marriage or being sponsored by a Vietnamese spouse or parent, what are the details there?
Yeah, this path grants residency based on family ties. If you're married to a Vietnamese citizen, you might qualify for a TRC for family reasons, and that gives you legal residency. However, and this is a really important point, the source makes very clear, even having this TRC doesn't automatically grant you the right to work. You still need to register any income you earn and pay taxes on it. So it sorts out your legal residency. But the work aspect still needs addressing, maybe through one of the other methods we discuss, or at least by ensuring full tax compliance.
Okay, it's really clear that while these legal options need more effort up front, they give you a stability and, frankly, peace of mind that the whole gray zone thing just can't offer. Building on that, our source, the Living Vietnam podcast, also shares some really valuable practical advice, especially from their Practical Advice Plus Community Tips section. So given all these crucial insights, what are the smart practical moves to, stay out of trouble and actually thrive there?
Yeah, these are good down-to-earth tips. For anyone not on a proper work visa, the source suggests a few key things to minimize risk. First, and this seems obvious but important, Do not publicly advertise your freelance services if you're on a tourist visa. Keep a very low profile about your work. Second, if you really need to meet clients, maybe use a co-working space rather than a public cafe, just for discretion. And critically maintain a very clear separation between your life in Vietnam and your tax obligations back home, or wherever they might be. Make sure you're paying what's due, where it's due.
That tax point again, it keeps coming up, doesn't it? What's the last bit of practical advice?
The final piece, and it's a big one, is the strong advice to actually consult a local immigration consultant or a legal advisor in Vietnam. They know the specific, current nuances of the law and the way things work on the ground far better than anyone online can tell you. They can give personalized guidance for your situation.
That sounds like very smart advice. And what about the common mistakes? The source mentions things expats often get wrong. It's always useful to know the pitfalls to avoid.
Absolutely. One of the most common mistakes highlighted is just assuming that keeping a quiet profile is the same as being legally compliant. As we've said, it might lead to tolerance now, but it isn't actually legal, and the tolerance could vanish. Another major pitfall is completely ignoring tax obligations, both potentially in Vietnam and definitely back home. And finally, just being caught unprepared or surprised by immigration officers during visa runs or extension processes. That usually happens if you haven't really understood the rules or the local context properly.
Right, yeah. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst kind of thing. And that pro tip from the community mentioned in the source about actually registering a sole proprietorship, Aknon Kalata, or maybe even an LLC, Kante, TNHH, in Vietnam. That seems like the ultimate move for serious players, doesn't it?
It really does seem like the ultimate long-term approach for many people. And this raises an important question about the sort of value proposition. Registering a business entity in Vietnam offers more than just peace of mind. It opens doors to legal residence, makes banking easier. Yes, it involves an investment, both time and money, but the source strongly suggests it's a worthwhile one if you're serious about staying long-term. It genuinely shifts your status from just kind of getting by as a visitor to truly belonging as a recognized, legitimate part of the business landscape there. It really changes the whole paradigm of your life in Vietnam.
That's really powerful advice, actually, moving from just existing somewhere to properly establishing roots. So let's bring it all back to our main question for this deep dive. Can you freelance or work remotely from Vietnam legally? What's the final verdict?
Well, the short answer is yes, you absolutely can. But, and it's a big but only if you follow the right path and you really understand the nuances that we've just unpacked here.
Right. And the key takeaway seems undeniable. Tourist visas are not a sustainable long-term solution if you intend to work remotely from Vietnam. It might be tolerated for now, maybe, but it's definitely not a secure foundation to build a life on.
Exactly. Knowledge is most valuable when understood and applied, right? And this deep dive, drawing from Fong's insights, hopefully provides a clearer roadmap for engaging responsibly. If you're planning to stay in Vietnam, making things official isn't just safer for you, protecting you from future crackdowns or policy shifts. It's also fundamentally a sign of respect and contribution to the country you're calling home. It lets you become a fully recognized member of that society, rather than just existing in that uncertain gray zone.
That sums it up perfectly, which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. As the world gets ever more digitally connected, how do we actually see global talent and national borders truly reconciling? And maybe what responsibility do we as remote workers hold in navigating these evolving, sometimes ambiguous landscapes? It's definitely something to think about, these gray zones popping up in our increasingly borderless work world. We'll leave you with that. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.